Okay, so the two research questions that I'm trying to answer. The first one is, how do novice educators describe the role of spontaneous decision making to influence their instructional practice? And then the second one is, how do novice educators describe the role of conscious decision making to influence their instructional practice? So you won't answer those questions directly, but the questions those that I shared with you will kind of help us dig out and kind of get to the answers to those questions. And what I'll do is I'll use the aggregate data from all of my interviews. There'll be about 15 individual interviews and then 2 focus groups, and I'll use all the aggregate data to try to answer those questions, if that makes sense. So, all right. Okay. So the first 4 questions are just around general decision making. So question 1, what skills and attributes do you feel are important when it comes to making effective decisions?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing is being sure to know both your audience as well as your environment. Because no matter what decision you make, you're going to have to consider, who's going to be affected by whatever decision you make, in addition to how your surroundings could even have an impact on whatever decision you have to make. Regardless of the actual decision, if you are not aware of who it is that you're going to be affecting, as well as everything surrounding you and what the outcome could be, it could lead to results that you were not expecting, especially if you had a desired outcome.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, question 2. What process do you use to make sure your decision process is correct? Give me specific examples at school. Like, what process do you go through just to make sure? We all know that sometimes we work through these processes and the decision is still wrong, but what do you try to work through?
The most important thing I try to consider when it comes to my students in terms of the decision is looking at the safety of the student. And safety, I really consider that to be a very broad term in this regard, uh, namely because not every decision is going to be something that's going to have a physical uh, aspect of safety, because it might be, the subject matter that's being taught. There may be some that it could have directly influenced them, maybe in the past or something that I may not necessarily know, and it could hit them harder or hit them in a different way than what the actual general, lesson is supposed to be. So I do my best to make sure that, I have a good understanding, rapport with my students, so that if I'm going to be not only touching on a practical school-based lesson, but also have some real life aspect in it, I do want to make sure that the safety of the student, both physical and emotional, is going to be one of positive result, rather than something that could find myself in a situation that I might be talking to a student, or directly talking with like a counselor, or you know not being aware of something that had an impact that I had no clue over, which you can't predict everything. But as long as you have a general understanding of, your students' backgrounds, uh, those type of natures, you usually get the result that you're hoping for.
Has there been a time that you didn't get the result you were hoping for? And if so, what did you do about it?
There was a specific time, my first year, and it was something that I typically try to have an environment that is one of, learning, but also one of positivity and fun, because I've always felt that the more students enjoy where they're at, the more they're going to be engaged in what's going on. And one of my things that I've always done is just have some kind of little joke or something humorous. If they come in, they see it, they can see it's going to be a good day. And on one particular day, I just had a bit of wordplay that actually had a negative effect on a student because it, you know, was something that had a personal effect on them in terms of uh, something with their family. And I had no clue. It wasn't any kind of a bad situation. It was just something that on that particular day, uh, it just hit a little close to home, and it got the student really upset. Um, and what we ended up doing is, the individual, took me aside, told me what was going on. Uh, and I just immediately responded by just removing it and putting something different, so as I didn't have that kind of result uh, again, especially since I had the same student later on in class in a different one. So it was all about making sure to take into consideration who was involved and then just readjusting.
That's good. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So the next one is describe a time that you made an unpopular decision. And this can be, it doesn't necessarily have to be work related, but a time that you made an unpopular decision. How did you handle the feedback and how would you handle that differently? Sorry, my dogs are losing it.
You're fine. You're fine. Actually, there's a very recent situation where a couple days earlier this week, my students were expressing, how they disagree with the collective punishment idea. When one person does something, everybody gets affected. And I totally understand with them. And I do my best to, make sure that I don't do that because I do care about the opinions of my students. I've always felt that, when I set up class rules, procedures, and whatnot, I do make sure to get these students' input so that they feel that they've had a hand in making the class environment appropriate for everyone. We were doing a review for an exam that they were taking this past week. And, there were specific rules in terms of how we were playing the game. And I had a student that clearly was going against the rules, even though it was uh, a situation where they were going to try and pull plausible deniability. And the only reason I could tell that that was going on is because the specific rule for our trash ball game was if, a team gets it right and is going to be making their shot for some bonus points for the little review game, if your side, if anybody, talks or, talks is what I said, they're going to get whatever points they were shooting for. And as an extra challenge, I had it that if they made a shot that was essentially across the room, they could remove all of the points that had been accrued by the other team. And in this particular instance, uh, one student was getting ready to shoot, and this student, again, who I strongly felt and was later confirmed was going to be pulling a plausible deniability type aspect, intentionally makes this loud, exaggerated breath right before the person shot. And his team, said, why don't you move and center up before you shoot? So the student does so, and the same person who had made that exaggerated breath does it again, and I can immediately pick up it has a little louder audibility. He does it a third time, another slight increase, and then does it right at the point a fourth time that they shoot. on which case I just made the judgment call, uh, go ahead and take the points because the student missed. And the team got particularly upset uh, for that instance and tried to remind me on just how I'd said earlier in the week on collective punishment. And, I explained them my situation, laid out the things that I'd noticed, witnessed, and observed, and pointed out that I understand that you are unhappy with this decision, but this is not an instance to me of collective punishment because there's no feasible way I can, you know, affect the one person on your team for what they did. This is one of those instances that it's going to affect everybody, and there's no way around it. Um, and it essentially shut the review down at that point. The team was completely disengaged at that point. Um,
So what would
and
you do anything different if you
in
went?
that in that particular instance, I feel that I handled it correctly. The only thing I would have done differently is if I hadn't done what I did at the end of class. And what I specifically did uh, is I talked one on one with the student that had initially raised my suspicions. I, cleared uh, the room so that we could be in an open setting where we talked one on one. And I said, look, it's just you, just me. You're not in trouble. But I do want to talk about this with you. And I want you to just be 100% honest. And we just leave it, you know, done and over with after we're done talking. I explained why I did what I did. I explained how I felt the way that I did. And then I just asked, am I correct in my presumptions or did I make a mistake? And I was willing to take, if he said I made a mistake, even if I was 100% could have proven it beyond a shadow of a doubt, I'd have still taken their word for it. And, the student was really honest and said, I was trying to see what I could get away with. And I think that would have been the only thing I would have done differently if I had not thought about meeting with that student one on one to kind of get their input so that if I was told I made a mistake or even found out I did make a mistake, be willing to use that as an opportunity to show that, number one, even as a teacher, I make a mistake. And number two, being willing to show that it means a lot more if you take ownership to making a mistake versus just trying to deny or trying to show that or trying to stay at being the one that's correct.
Some really good lessons in that kind of impromptu situation, right? That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, so the next one is, after making a decision, what process do you use to reflect on that decision?
If there's something that I need to reflect on, especially in the educational aspect, I've actually got a notebook that I keep any and all feedback that is given to me, by admin or maybe, fellow teachers when I'm seeking advice or whatnot, just for the sake of something that I can come back and look back upon if I ever get into a situation, or being able to use it for the sake of not making a potential mistake on my part, making the same one. Because I would rather it be shown that, number one, I took constructive feedback for the sake of trying to learn from it, and at least be able to point out that even if I make the same mistake, I can go, hey, it's not that I didn't, consider what was said the first time, because it is right here, in that particular moment, I had to make a judgment call and it just didn't go the right way. So I always make sure for anything that I'm going to reflect on, I've got it uh, jotted down for me as something to fall back and look upon in case I get into a similar situation.
That's good. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so the next 4 questions are going to center around decisions in your instructional practice. So we're going to talk about the decisions that you make in the classroom related to instructional practice. What type of decisions do you make in the classroom about instruction? They can be general or specific.
Um, it does again go back to what I'd said initially in reference to student safety and also student impact, because I've made it my personal uh, way of teaching to always have the strong rapport with my students. That is the very first thing I believe in before I even start, a given year, uh, even with repeat students, is just making sure that, I know as best as I can who they are, what they represent, everything from, just maybe things that they've shared with me, or if there's things like that can affect learning like IEPs or home life issues, just trying to make sure that I know as much as I can about my audience, and that everything that I'm going to do is going to have both a safe and hopefully educational impact on the students, because you've got to be able to be multidimensional. That's always, something I've said to many people that have talked with me or asked me, how I try to make an impact in the classroom. And it's just because you cannot be set in your ways. You've got to be willing to adapt, be willing to change, and be understanding of the fact that no day, no month, no year will necessarily always be the same. There's going to be change, and you have to be willing to go with it. Otherwise, you're going to end up making decisions that could have negative impacts, not just on your students, but even yourself, uh, if you're not willing to.
Yeah, that's good. So talk to me a little bit about about decisions that you make in the classroom that could have a negative impact. Just a couple. What around what? Sorry. Um, some of those decisions that you make maybe quickly that if you don't really think it through could have a negative impact.
In the event that I'm in uh, a situation where no matter what, it's going to be be a catch 22 where there's going to be some kind of an impact. The thing that I look at is what is going to be essentially the best result for the most people involved in I kind of consider the both the short uh future as well as the distance future. I kind of try and take them into consideration at the same time, uh but I typically have to look at the short version or the short future for those in the moment, and how many more can be safely and strongly impacted uh, as a whole, because there's uh, there's going to be those situations and times where you don't have that much reaction time, and you've got to consider how many people can be impacted, whether you don't respond or if you do respond. And if you are going to choose to respond, you've got to be able to look at those directly involved and then the rest of the audience that's involved as well. And I try to take it from an aspect of what decision can I make that's going to have a more positive, as best positive, I should say, effect on as many people, uh, or I should say, more people than um, a smaller amount, because it's hard at times to be able to consider everybody. So in those situations where you cannot consider everybody, no matter what you do, you've got to do those. You've got to make the decision based upon the most that can be impacted. And I try to find myself not in a situation of better to ask for forgiveness than permission, uh, which I offhand I'm not sure if I can think of any, but I do always consider it with just looking at making sure as many people will benefit from it versus a small amount.
Perfect. Very good. So the next question is still part of question 5, but you mentioned a little while ago about students with IEPs. So walk me through the process of making a decision about a student in your classroom that has an IEP. How do you decide how you're going to interact with that student in terms of your instructional practice?
Um, the very first thing I try and do, especially if I've got multiple students that have differing IEPs, is consider the what's the word? Can't think of that word.
Modifications.
Yes, considering those modifications and trying to find a comparative as best as possible if there's more than one student. If there's a class where I only have one that's going to be directly impacted by an IEP, I try to make sure that the modifications that are requested, trying to get as many targeted as possible. And one of the things that I did this semester is actually making my class a series of small groups and doing a lot of peer pairing by having those students, not just those with IEP, but just looking at overall performance, having small groups where it's a good balance between, those that may be struggling in an area and having those that can help them out in the area that they're struggling. And it also gives me, spots that I can go to when I'm doing instruction and doing, independent work, that I can go to each one and know that with group A, I need to make the focus on this. With group B, I can change my focus and put it on this. And I've noticed that it's actually been very, very helpful in the grand.
Very good. So would you say that you make the instructional decisions then for students who are not IEP students in a similar way? Or how would that differ?
Typically I do, even if a student doesn't have an IEP, because it still goes back to knowing your audience. When you've got so many different learning styles, no matter how comfortable you are in maybe presenting information or doing project-based learning or doing direct instruction, you've got to be able to consider every single student's learning abilities. And even if the lesson is something that has to be direct instruction and it only affects a small portion, you've got to still be able to find a way to manipulate some of those other traits that those other students need into the instruction in some way, so that there can be some kind of benefit for those that maybe not get the direct approach as easy as some of the others. So with me, it does go back to just making sure to know the audience and trying to target as many different learning styles as I can, so that more of the class can get benefit of the instruction and the lessons being learned versus that small number.
Perfect. Okay. All right, so we're going to move to number 6. Describe a time you made a difficult decision about instruction. What led you to the final decision?
In thinking about it, one of the things that seems to frequently come up in terms of my teaching is the fact that I try and actually use and utilize law into my teaching, and I've noticed at times that it seems to be very unpopular, and I say that because when you are working with middle grade students, there's a lot of thought processes that is not their own, and there's a lot of copying of things that usually come from home, and it can create at times some very negative environments. And I found myself frequently at honestly, it seems the beginning of every year with my 7th grade students, typically having to explain why I follow the process of separation of church and state. And it typically comes into an interesting scenario because I'll have a couple of students say some things that are, religiously biased, and I shut it down, and it creates, usual chaos. And I can say that, it seems that every year I found myself having to explain, uh, no, I did not, say, X thing. This is what was said. And I made it clear that in my classroom, I prefer that we do things based upon, you know, proven factual things. Not because I disagree with things, but because I do not want anybody in the classroom or the school that we find ourselves in a situation where we're having to defend something because of the separation of church and state, someone feeling that it was violated. So I take that into very strong consideration, and have, at times, like I've said, it often leads with me having to explain something that was clearly misconstrued, but I make that decision because I know at the end of the day, in keeping the, straight, fair, unbiased teaching style, there shouldn't be any negative consequence.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so describe any changes you've noticed in your decision-making skill set around instruction since you started your teaching career.
I think the thing that I've noticed over the, especially this year, is my quickness to adapt when I've noticed that, maybe a lesson didn't go 100% the way I'd planned it to. Um, I've been, I've always been one that if I make a mistake or it doesn't go as planned, I take the ownership to it. And I'm even straightforward with my students that, if I had a plan with a lesson and it didn't go 100%, or, I could clearly tell that the concepts were missed, next day that comes in, first thing I'll do is go, hey, guys, I had a plan yesterday, didn't really work out. So I'm going to quickly look at it again, but we'll look at it from a different response or a different way. So I've noticed that as long as I'm willing to take the ownership and admit that somehow a concept was missed and I'm the one that takes, the, uh, I don't want to say fault, but, just take the, outcome not coming, as results instead of trying to say it was the student's fault. It keeps the students engaged with class, even if it's something that they didn't enjoy the day before. Because I can at least see that if the concepts weren't learned the first time, but I see it was the second time, it then gives me something that if I've got to teach something similarly or concept similarly, I know, all right, this is the way I've got to do it this time if I want to make sure that it's going to be effective so that I don't have to necessarily get behind by having to maybe, reteach something I'd already done.
Yeah, very good. So what do you think led to kind of that shift in mindset?
Just, I think the shift came from just being true to feedback that I'd gotten and received even prior to becoming a teacher, and that's just working on my communication skills and making sure that I do know my audience, because I've, just like any human, I have a tendency to fall into, the trap of a habit, and I will at times still find myself speaking at a level that is a lot higher than who my general audience is. And I think just being more reflective, I'm getting to a point where it's becoming a lot easier to catch myself in those moments before, for lack of better words, the damage is done and I've just fallen right back in my trap.
Yep. Yeah, that's perfect. So, okay. So the last one in this section, describe a time you sought help from others to make a decision on instruction and what was the outcome?
I don't even have to think twice on this one. I remember my first year, with the eighth graders in my first year, for the most part, I got along with most of them, and the way I did things, was great for all but a few. And I was just getting absolutely nowhere with a few students in terms of, keeping that focus in class, keeping the, lessons moving. And I immediately just reached out to the individuals that had had them before and just sought that, insight, hey, you've had these students before. What worked in your classroom to, get something, taught or be able to get through the day without there being less chaos? And then taking and applying their feedback. And the outcome was it was a lot more productive uh, than how it initially started. It wasn't perfect. I mean, it was my first year, and there's going to, still be those challenges, but there were a lot more days where we were able to get things done the way I intended for them to be done, rather than, me just wanting to reconsider if I'm in the right field or not.
Right. That's awesome. So, okay, we're going to shift our focus one more time to the last four questions. And this is going to center specifically around conscious and spontaneous decision. So the first question is, based on the decisions you've shared, which ones do you typically make quickly and which ones do you spend more time thinking about? You specifically mentioned, the students with the IEPs. And it sounded as though you spend some time really reflecting on those modifications and how you can make those. So why do you feel like, if that's what I understood correctly, why do you feel like you spend more time thinking about those situations?
Um, the I think it's going to be twofold. The first and foremost is um, I don't want there to be any fallback by not adhering to an IEP. Uh, and I say that because, in the past, I've been made aware, or, I'd be told like, hey, so and so is really, really, big on making sure that you follow their IEP 100%. There's been issues in the past. And, when I heard that, even though it's never been an issue for any student with an IEP, I do keep that in the back of my mind because I would rather be able to prevent that kind of a situation, so that uh, I not only have a productive classroom, but I don't find myself in any kind of a legal situation. And I shouldn't have to consider that, you know, in terms of my teaching and what I do, but I would rather, have the knowledge of knowing, the extra bit of information for um, those few students, and being able to modify my classroom so that they can actually feel inclusive instead of feeling like they're either a liability or being treated differently, by utilizing the classroom with their uh, modifications and making it a part of the actual day-to-day practices, and not making it look like it's a focus. It To me, it gives the actual intent of making those students feel that they are inclusive with the general education students, and not just somebody that occasionally has to leave the room for specialized one-on-one work in a, but that they're just like everyone else, because I feel that they they and this is just from personal experience, they've had too often where even their peers make them feel like they're isolated. And I feel that they need to know that there's at least somebody who wants them to feel that you're just as good as everyone else.
So when thinking about those quick decisions you make, and it doesn't necessarily have to be specific to instruction, but just real name some of those quick decisions that you make on a daily basis in the classroom.
Um, Usually it's just a matter of being able to think quickly on my feet in terms of how I want the students to uh, show uh, comprehension and understanding of the lesson today. Um, while I may not necessarily utilize like an exit ticket or something, I do try and vary how I can see that the students actually grasp the concepts that I was initially going for. And I, may have like some kind of an exit ticket, or uh, something to actually physically see uh, the desired result, but it usually devolves into being able to verbally and orally see that result, because when I can actually see the students thinking about what we went over and being able to apply it in a situation that doesn't involve them, just writing something down or just giving copy paste the answer to something I directly said, but getting that individualized thought process. It seems to have a more meaningful and longer lasting impact versus something that gets written down, is going to be remembered for a short time, maybe get remembered on an assessment, and then it never gets thought of again.
Good. So, I have to make sure I'm unmuted because the dogs have moments of being crazy. So, so what makes something a quick decision for you?
I consider, I feel that something is a quick decision when I almost don't have, I've got very little response time in terms of making a decision, where I don't even have the time to consider, is it going to be a forgiveness and permission? Is it going to be something I can remotely think about? It is something that is just going to have to be spontaneous, on the fly, go with the gut, based upon what I immediately see, and just run with the results and kind of just be a wing and a prayer. Uh,
We do those a lot, don't we?
oh,
Absolutely. Very good. Okay. So you've talked some about spontaneous decisions, and you've talked about spending more time on other decisions. So what resources, if any, do you draw from to make those more conscious, rational decisions?
that actually goes back to, if I've got the time to think about it, if it's something that I can really plan out, um, it goes back to my reflection notebook. Um, and the reason being is because if I've got the actual time to really think things out, and have some uh, foresight rather than a hindsight opportunity, I'd rather go ahead and take the time to see, have I been in the situation? If I've been in the situation, what worked, what didn't work, and try and apply it for the intent of, previous best practice, and hope that it actually goes in that way again, depending on, of course, who I'm going to be teaching at the time that I have to. Um, and just being able to rely on that previous experience, uh, and be able to show that if something is to come out of it, I can show that, hey, this was a similar situation. This is what I'd done in the past. This is what I did this time. And for whatever reason, this was one of those off chances that it didn't go the way it had done the previous, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. And then I've just got something else to consider in the future.
Very good. Okay, last question. So, you have several viable options to make a decision. How do you choose which path to follow?
No matter what, I make sure that the decision that I make really, again, goes back to the students. Um, yes, I might be thinking in the back of my mind, how is it going to directly affect me? But at the end of the day, I profession because I wanted to make an impact on those that are going to be going out in the real world.
Mhm.
And I would rather make sure that the decisions that I have to make are going to have both an educational and lifelong impact on those students and people that are going to one day essentially be our future. And I do my best to try and take as many into consideration into what will hopefully be something that will make a better future for them, so that if they happen to be the students that have a lot going on, don't have much happening for them, that the decisions I make will impact them in a way to hopefully make a change and allow them to continue the goodwill that, is needed to really make the world a better place. And if I can make some decisions that get some individuals to want to make a change and impact, then, that's going to be what I'm going to do every single time.
So good, so good. Well, Francis, that's all I have. Is there anything else that you want to add that maybe I haven't asked?
Not related to what we're talking about.
Okay.
If that,
Yeah. All right. Well, then I'm going to stop the recording. Let's see.